A 22-year-old enslaved woman stands in front of a mirror, smoothing down her best dress. Her hands are shaking. Not from nervousness, from fury, because tonight, while the most powerful man in America sits down for dinner with his guests, she's going to vanish, disappear into a city of 40,000 people. And when he discovers she's gone, when he realizes what she's done, it will humiliate him in front of the entire nation. Her name is Ona Judge. And the man she's running from? George Washington, first president of the United States, the father of his country, the man whose face is on the dollar bill, the man who just 8 years earlier stood before Congress and helped ratify a constitution that began with the words, "We the people." But Ona Judge knows something that most Americans in 1796 don't want to think about. Those words, "We the people," don't include her. They never did. Because George Washington, the man who fought for American liberty, who declared that all men are created equal, owned over 300 human beings, and Ona Judge was his wife's favorite. Tonight she's going to escape, and what happens next will expose the most uncomfortable truth about America's founding, that the man who gave this country freedom spent his final years hunting down a young woman whose only crime was wanting that same freedom for herself. This is the story they don't teach in schools, the story of how George Washington, American hero, became Ona Judge's persecutor, and how one enslaved woman's courage revealed the lies at the heart of the American Revolution. Let me take you back to where it all began. Ona Judge was born in 1773 at Mount Vernon, George Washington's sprawling plantation in Virginia. Her mother, Betty, was an enslaved seamstress who worked in the mansion house. Her father was Andrew Judge, a white English tailor who Washington had hired and who later left the plantation, abandoning Betty and their daughter to slavery. By the laws of Virginia, Ona's status followed her mother. It didn't matter that her father was white and free. Betty was enslaved, so Ona was enslaved, property from birth. But Ona wasn't sent to work in the fields. At age 10, she was brought into the mansion house to serve Martha Washington directly. This was considered a privilege. House slaves wore better clothes, ate better food, weren't subjected to the brutal physical labor that killed field workers before they reached 40. But privilege is still slavery, and Ona Judge knew it from the moment she was old enough to understand what the word meant. She learned to sew with extraordinary skill. She learned to style Martha Washington's hair in the elaborate fashions of the 1780s. She learned to move silently through rooms, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to become essentially invisible while standing 3 feet away. She learned all the skills that enslaved people had to master to survive. And she learned something else. She learned to read. This was illegal in Virginia. Teaching enslaved people to read was forbidden because literacy was dangerous. Literate slaves could read newspapers, could forge travel passes, could write their own freedom. But somehow in the chaos of Mount Vernon's daily life, Ona Judge learned. And once she could read, she discovered something that would change her life forever. She read about the American Revolution, about liberty, about natural rights, about the radical idea that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. She read George Washington's own words about freedom, and she started asking questions that enslaved people weren't supposed to ask. If these principles are true, why am I enslaved? If all men are created equal, why am I property? If this is the land of liberty, why am I a slave? In 1789, everything changes. George Washington is elected first president of the United States. The capital moves from New York to Philadelphia, and Martha Washington insists on bringing her best servants, including Ona Judge. Philadelphia in 1790 is a different world from Virginia. Pennsylvania had passed a gradual abolition law in 1780. Any enslaved person brought into Pennsylvania who remained there for 6 consecutive months automatically became free. It was called the 6-month rule, and it terrified Southern slaveholders who had to conduct business in the nation's capital. George Washington knew about this law, and he deliberately, methodically, systematically broke it to keep Ona Judge and his other enslaved servants from claiming their freedom. Here's how he did it. Every 5 months and 29 days, Washington would send his enslaved servants back to Virginia for a few days, then bring them back to Philadelphia, Technically, they never reached the 6-month threshold. The clock reset. Their path to legal freedom was deliberately blocked by the man who was, at that very moment, signing laws and giving speeches about American liberty. Ona Judge wasn't stupid. She understood exactly what Washington was doing. She watched as free black people walked the streets of Philadelphia. She met members of the Free African Society. She attended services at the African Church. She saw what freedom looked like, just beyond her reach, constantly denied by a legal technicality, and Washington's determination to keep his property. For 6 years, Ona Judge served in the president's house in Philadelphia. She lived in the executive mansion, dressed Martha Washington every morning, attended state dinners where foreign dignitaries dined with the president, listened to conversations about democracy and freedom and the future of the republic. And every single day, she lived with the knowledge that she was a piece of property, that despite all the talk about liberty, despite all the speeches about human rights, George Washington valued his legal right to own her more than her human right to be free. Then, in 1796, everything came to a head. Ona Judge was 22 years old, and Martha Washington decided to give her away as a wedding gift. Martha's granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis, was getting married, and Martha decided that Ona would make the perfect gift. She would be sent to Virginia, far from Philadelphia's free black community, to serve Eliza for the rest of her life. Ona's fate was sealed, her future decided without her consent, without her input, as if she were a piece of furniture being moved from one room to another. But here's what Martha Washington didn't know. Ona Judge had been planning her escape for months. She had made contact with the free black community in Philadelphia. She had friends who promised to help. She knew that ships left Philadelphia's docks every day, heading north to New Hampshire, Massachusetts, places where slavery was dead or dying. All she needed was the right moment. May 21st, 1796. The Washingtons are hosting a dinner party. The house is full of guests, servants rushing everywhere, chaos and noise and distraction. It's perfect. Ona Judge walks out the front door of the president's house. She's wearing her best dress because if she took luggage, it would attract attention. She walks calmly, deliberately, as if she's running an errand for Mrs. Washington. Nobody stops her, nobody questions her. Enslaved servants ran errands all the time. She meets her contact from the free black community. They take her to the docks. There's a ship, the Nancy, preparing to depart for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The captain, John Bowles, is sympathetic. He agrees to take her as a passenger, no questions asked. That night, while George Washington sleeps, Ona Judge sails away from slavery. When Martha Washington discovers Ona is missing the next morning, the reaction is volcanic. She doesn't ask if Ona is hurt or in danger. She asks who helped her escape, because in Martha's mind, Ona couldn't possibly have planned this herself. Some abolitionist must have seduced her away, corrupted her, stolen Washington property. It never occurs to Martha that Ona Judge simply wanted to be free. George Washington is more pragmatic. He's furious, but he's also practical. Ona Judge knows things. She's lived in the president's house for 6 years. She's heard private conversations, seen private documents, knows intimate details about America's first family. Washington can't afford to have a disgruntled, formerly enslaved woman talking to Northern abolitionists. He needs her back, and he's willing to use the full power of the United States government to get her. Washington contacts the U.S. Treasury Department. He activates a network of customs officials, port authorities, and political allies. He places advertisements in newspapers describing Ona Judge, offering a reward for her capture. He writes letters to friends in northern states, asking them to keep an eye out for a runaway slave matching her description. The President of the United States is conducting a manhunt for a 22-year-old woman whose only crime was wanting freedom. It takes several months, but eventually someone recognizes Ona Judge in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She's working as a domestic servant for a local family, living under her own name, attending church, beginning to build a free life. Washington receives the information and immediately sends his nephew, Burwell Bassett, to Portsmouth with instructions: retrieve Ona Judge by any means necessary. Negotiate if possible. Kidnap if required. Just bring her back. But here's what Washington didn't anticipate. Portsmouth's free black community got word that slave catchers were coming, and they warned Ona Judge. When Burwell Bassett arrives at the house where Ona is working and demands to see her, she agrees to meet him. But she's not alone. She's surrounded by members of Portsmouth's free black community and white abolitionist allies. And when Bassett tries to grab her, tries to force her onto a ship back to Virginia, the community intervenes. There's a standoff. Bassett realizes he can't kidnap Ona Judge in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses without causing a riot, so he tries a different approach. He offers her a deal. Come back willingly, he tells her. Come back to Mount Vernon, serve Mrs. Washington for just a few more years, and the president promises he'll free you in his will. You'll be emancipated when he dies. You have his word. Ona Judge looks at Burwell Bassett, looks at this white man, this representative of George Washington offering her future freedom in exchange for present slavery. And she says something that will echo through history. I am free now, and choose to remain so. Think about that for a moment. A 22-year-old formerly enslaved woman, facing the nephew of the most powerful man in America, is offered eventual freedom if she just returns to slavery. And she refuses. She chooses uncertain freedom now over promised freedom later, because Ona Judge understood something fundamental. A promise from an enslaver is worthless. Washington had promised her nothing would change, then tried to give her away. Why would she trust any promise he made about freedom? Bassett returns to Virginia empty-handed. Washington is livid. He can't believe that Ona Judge refused. In his mind, he was being generous. He was offering her something. And she had the audacity to say no. So he tries again. In 1799, now retired from the presidency, Washington makes one final attempt to recapture Ona Judge. He contacts Senator John Langdon of New Hampshire and asks for help retrieving his property. Langdon is sympathetic but warns Washington that any attempt to kidnap Ona Judge would cause massive public outcry in New Hampshire, where abolitionist sentiment is strong. Washington doesn't care. He wants his property back. He drafts a letter outlining his plan. Langdon should arrange for Ona to be seized and put on a ship to Virginia before anyone can intervene. It's essentially a kidnapping plot orchestrated by a former president. But the letter is intercepted. Abolitionists get word of the plan, and they publish Washington's letter in newspapers across New Hampshire. Suddenly, everyone knows that George Washington, the great hero of liberty, is trying to kidnap a free black woman and drag her back into slavery. The public embarrassment is enormous. Washington is forced to abandon his plan, and Ona Judge remains free. George Washington died on December 14, 1799. He was 67 years old. In his will, he freed all the enslaved people he personally owned, though only after Martha's death. But here's the thing. Ona Judge wasn't technically Washington's property. She was part of the Custis estate, Martha's property from her first marriage, so even if Ona had returned, even if she'd believed Washington's promise, she wouldn't have been freed. She would have remained enslaved to the Custis family. Washington's promise was a lie. Ona Judge knew it. That's why she refused. Ona Judge lived the rest of her life in freedom in New Hampshire. She married a free black sailor named Jack Staines. They had 3 children. She worked as a domestic servant, attended church, became a respected member of Portsmouth's free black community. But freedom came with costs. Ona was never able to return to Virginia. She never saw her mother Betty again. Her siblings remained enslaved at Mount Vernon. She lived in constant fear that slave catchers might come for her, that the Custis family might attempt what Washington couldn't accomplish. In 1845, nearly 50 years after her escape, a young abolitionist minister named Benjamin Chase tracked down Ona Judge. She was 72 years old, living in poverty in Greenland, New Hampshire. Chase interviewed her and she told him everything: her life at Mount Vernon, her escape, Washington's attempts to recapture her, her refusal to return. Chase published the interview in an abolitionist newspaper, and for the first time, the American public heard Ona Judge's story in her own words. The interviewer asked her if she regretted leaving the Washingtons, if she missed the comfort of Mount Vernon compared to her difficult life in poverty. Ona Judge's response is one of the most powerful statements in American history. No, I am free, and have, I trust, been made a child of God by the means. She was asked if she'd ever wished she'd stayed with the Washingtons. No, she said firmly. "I would rather live in hardship and poverty than be enslaved." Think about what that means. After 50 years of struggling financially, of living in a society that still discriminated against her, of raising children in poverty, of losing her husband and 2 of her 3 children. After all of that, Ona Judge still said freedom was worth it. She chose freedom over comfort, over security, over the empty promises of powerful men. Ona Judge died on February 25, 1848, in Greenland, New Hampshire. She was 75 years old. She died free. And that, in the end, was all that mattered to her. But here's the question we need to ask. Why don't we know Ona Judge's story? Why isn't she taught in every American history class alongside George Washington? Why do we spend so much time venerating the father of his country and so little time acknowledging the people he enslaved? Because Ona Judge's story is uncomfortable. It forces us to confront the fundamental contradiction at America's founding. The men who wrote that all men are created equal-owned human beings. The revolution fought for liberty was led by slaveholders. The Constitution that established freedom enshrined slavery. George Washington is a hero in American mythology. He's the man who couldn't tell a lie, who chopped down the cherry tree, who crossed the Delaware, who refused to become king. We name our capital after him, our first state. Countless schools, streets, monuments. But George Washington also spent years hunting down a young woman who wanted freedom. He used his political power, his wealth, his connections, to try to drag her back into slavery. And when she refused, when she chose poverty and freedom over comfort and chains, he died still believing she belonged to him. That's the George Washington that Ona Judge knew. And that's the George Washington we need to remember. Because here's the truth. America was built on a lie. Not the lie that liberty is important, that part's true. But the lie that liberty was meant for everyone. It wasn't. It was meant for white men who owned property. Everyone else, women, black people, indigenous people, the poor, had to fight for the freedom that the founders claimed was self-evident and universal. Ona Judge was one of those fighters. She didn't give speeches or write manifestos. She didn't lead armies or organize movements. She just walked out a door one May evening in 1796 and decided she was free. And then, she spent the rest of her life proving it. Every day she lived free was a refutation of George Washington's worldview. Every year she survived in New Hampshire was proof that his promises were lies. Every breath she took as a free woman was an act of resistance against the man who claimed to own her. The father of liberty tried to destroy her freedom. And he failed. That failure matters, because it shows that enslaved people weren't passive victims waiting for white saviors to free them. They were active agents fighting for their own liberation. Ona Judge didn't wait for George Washington to free her, she freed herself. And she paid the price. She lived in poverty, she buried children, she never saw her mother again. Freedom cost her almost everything, but it was still worth it. That's the lesson of Ona Judge's story. That freedom isn't something granted by the powerful, it's something claimed by the courageous. That liberty isn't a gift from governments, it's a right seized by individuals willing to risk everything. George Washington believed he could own Ona Judge. He believed his property rights trumped her human rights. He believed that. His comfort, his wife's happiness, his reputation mattered more than a young woman's freedom. He was wrong. Ona Judge proved him wrong every day she lived free. Today, there's a small memorial to Ona Judge in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was erected in 2020, 224 years after her escape. There's a historical marker at the site where she lived. A few books tell her story, but she remains largely unknown. Meanwhile, George Washington's face is on our currency. His monument towers over Washington, D.C. His birthday is a federal holiday. He's revered, celebrated, mythologized. But Ona Judge is the hero of this story, not George Washington. Because George Washington fought for his own freedom and then tried to deny it to others. Ona Judge fought for everyone's freedom by claiming her own. That's the difference between liberty as a political slogan and freedom as a lived reality. George Washington gave us words about freedom. Ona Judge showed us what freedom actually means. And if we're serious about understanding American history, about reckoning with our past, about building a more just future. We need to honor Ona Judge's memory as much as we honor George Washington's, because the father of liberty persecuted a woman who only wanted to be free, and that woman won.